Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. September 16th, 1868, eastern Colorado. As the late summer sun sinks into the horizon, a group of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors sit in a loose circle around a cooking fire, enjoying an evening meal. Among them is a 45-year-old Cheyenne warrior named Roman Nose. He is a decades-long veteran of countless battles against settlers and soldiers from the United States, as well as raids against rival tribes. In the illustrious career he has compiled, Roman Nose has accrued many honors and a reputation amongst his people, his allies, and his enemies as a formidable tactician and a vicious fighter. Since the devastating Sand Creek Massacre of November 29, 1864, in which dozens or possibly hundreds of his fellow Cheyenne, men, women, and children, were mowed down without mercy at the command of Colonel John Chivington, Roman Nose had extracted his proverbial pound of flesh from the encroaching white settlers with a myopic fury. He had been born into a band of the Northern Cheyenne, around the year 1823, son of a prominent warrior named Lone Bear and a beautiful and highly regarded mother named Black Buffalo Woman. Though as a child he had gone by the name Moseskanetsa or Bat, he had acquired the name Wokini or Hook Nose from his notable physical features, a name which the Americans would interpret as Roman Nose. He had fought at the Battle of Julesburg in Wyoming in 1865 and wrought terror and trepidation upon travelers all along the segment of the Oregon Trail that stretched to the northern plains. He had visited Fort Larned in April of the previous year, during which Isaac Coates, U.S. General Winston Scott Hancock's surgeon, observed Roman Nose in an argument with the general, noting that, of all the chiefs, he is one of the fittest specimens physically of his race. He is quite 6 feet in height, finely formed with a large body and muscular limbs. His appearance was decidedly military, and on this occasion particularly so, since he wore the uniform of a general in the army. A 7-shooting Spencer carbine hung at the side of his saddle, 4 large Navy revolvers stuck in his belt, and a bow, already strung with arrows, were grasped in his left hand. Thus armed and mounted on a fine horse, he was a good representative of the god of war, and his manner showed plainly that he did not care if we talked or fought. Though he holds no formal position of leadership within the Cheyenne, Roman Nose has built his stature within the tribe and their allies through countless battles, raids, and buffalo hunts. All throughout his travels and fighting, Roman Nose had fought fearlessly, partly due to his own personal resolve and disposition, and partly due to his belief that his warbonnet possessed a protective magic over him that afforded him protection from the white man's weapons. He had received the warbonnet as a gift from the Lakota warrior White Bull, who assured him no harm would come to him while he wore the headdress, so long as he did not violate its medicine by consuming any food prepared with the white man's metal utensils. Known amongst his people as a deeply spiritual man, Roman Nose abided by these directives fastidiously. In addition to following the prescription of White Bull, Roman Nose would partake in days-long fasts from food and water, often arriving late to battles due to his extensive prayer routine. Still though, despite his trademark tardiness, Roman Nose has, and especially the last few months, been the terror of the United States government, marauding about his high plains homelands, wreaking havoc and killing soldiers and settlers wherever he can. The preceding summer months have been busy, hot, and bloody. But now, for a brief moment, as he sits here with his fellow warriors enjoying a warm piece of fry bread freshly made by a Sioux woman serving as cook for the camp, all seems well, at least momentarily. Then, with all the disruption of a rifle's retort, the cry comes out from returning scouts that a contingent of white soldiers has been spotted nearby, and that an attack must be made as soon as possible. As he has so many times before, Roman Nose halts his meal and makes ready for the attack that will take place the next day. Just as he is making his way back to his lodge, one of his warrior cohorts rushes up to him, eyes wide in panic. The warrior informs Roman Nose that the Sioux woman who served them their dinner, not knowing of Roman Nose's prohibition against eating food prepared with metal utensils, had used a metal spoon to serve up their dinner. This action, though unintentional, now has resounding consequences. Roman Nose now believes his medicine, the great protection offered by his warbonnet, has been compromised. The Cheyenne medicine man's ceremony for ostensibly restoring the power to the headdress will take days, a luxury the mighty warrior does not now have. As the night drags on, Roman Nose contemplates his next move, the millstone of fate weighing heavy on his mind. Only 12 miles away, on the dry fork of the Republican River, on the south bank of what is known as Delaware Creek, 27-year-old First Lieutenant Frederick Henry Beecher works alongside his men preparing their camp for the night. They are a unique contingent of both U.S. Army soldiers and civilian frontiersmen, a combined force of 50 in number, assembled for the express purpose of pursuing and combating the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors who have been so unyielding in their attacks in the previous few weeks. Commanding them is Major General George Alexander Forsyth of the 9th Cavalry, who had begun his career in 1861 as a lieutenant in the 8th Illinois Cavalry. Forsyth saw action in the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864, served as aide-de-camp for Major General Philip Sheridan, and had been awarded a brevet promotion to colonel on October 19th of 1864 for his actions during the Third Battle of Winchester and the Battle of Cedar Creek. Earlier in this year, he had been charged with assembling this motley band, whose ages ranged from their late teens to their early 60s. Beecher serves as second in command for this group, himself a veteran of the Civil War, acting as first lieutenant of the 16th Maine Volunteers from 1862 to 1864. He had fought at the Battle of Brooks Station, the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Battle of Chancellorsville, as well as the Battle of Gettysburg. He had been severely wounded twice, at both Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862, as well as Gettysburg on July 1st of 1863. At the Battle of Gettysburg, he had also received a citation for valor after refusing to surrender the regimental colors to the attacking Confederate forces. He was born in New Orleans in June of 1841 and graduated from Bowdoin College in Maine before volunteering for the Union Army. His family is one of prominent American stock, with his uncle Henry Ward Beecher being perhaps the most prominent Methodist preacher in America at the time. His aunt, Harriet Beecher Stowe, is perhaps the most famous writer in America, having authored the seminal fictional work in abolitionism at the time, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had served as a major media flashpoint in the galvanization of the country on the issue of slavery. His family is known as some of the most prominent and influential abolitionists in the whole of the Northeast. But they are also Americans, with a strident fidelity to their newly resolved Union and possessing no small amount of fervor for the fulfillment of the notion of manifest destiny. The country, fresh out of conflict within itself, now seems, 3 years after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, unapologetically obsessed with their own reconstruction and expansion. Both reconstruction and expansion, though, have thus far come at great cost. In the South, unrest continues to run rampant, with the seeds of long-held resentments being sowed far and wide. In the West, the ongoing war between the United States government and the menagerie of tribes that range from Mexico to Canada has once again become red-hot after 4 years of a comparative lull in heavy fighting. Though conflict on the bleeding edge of the frontier had indeed raged throughout the entirety of the American Civil War, it was only after 1865 that the federal government could marshal the might of their full resources in the fight against the Plains tribes. The mere existence of this 50-man force, though, now unfurling their bedrolls and picketing their horses down for the night, is evidence of the U.S. Army's assessment of the situation on the High Plains as a desperate one that calls for desperate measures if the attacks made by warriors who oftentimes have personal ties to those massacred by Shivington and company at Sand Creek are to ever be abated. On the morning of September 10th, this detachment had left Fort Wallace, located in present-day Kansas, following the trail of what they initially believed to be a force of 25 native warriors who had attacked a work detail roughly 13 miles from the fort. The trail, however, soon began to show signs of a far larger force of native Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors in the vicinity. This prospect, though, was an enticing one for many in the party, as the largest problem for many units fighting on the open plains was not as much in combating the native warriors in battle, but in actually finding them in the first place. The vast majority of the time, pursuing soldiers and citizens alike saw their attackers or their quarry, depending on the situation, disappear with specter-like ease into the seemingly endless flat grasslands. Now, as men begin to doze off and others take their turns standing watch, the night drags on, under the splendor of the northern plains sky. Many amongst them have lost friends and loved ones to the attacks of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe, and now burn for revenge that they hope is finally all too close at hand. However, even the most fervent pursuer amongst them would likely be shocked, and perhaps slightly horrified, to know that a massive camp of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe, hundreds or perhaps thousands strong, lies only a dozen miles away from their force of 50 men. But when the sun breaches the eastern horizon on the morning of the 17th, the rude awakening for this small force is at hand, both literally and figuratively. Silhouetted by the rising sun, lining the ridge tops around them, are hundreds of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors, resplendent in their war paint and letting loose war cries that jar awake those who have not yet been alerted by the men on watch. As First Lieutenant Beecher wipes the sleep from his eyes and takes stock of the situation at hand, his mind seems nearly unable to reconcile the bizarre sight before him. Not only are hundreds of warriors on the hilltops above them, but also are the wives and children of the warriors, looking on and exhorting their husbands and fathers to glory. Overseeing them from a distance is Roman Nose. Though not a formal chief, his leadership on the battlefield has been a pivotal element in the native warriors' successes in the preceding years. Now, as he watches on, Roman Nose fights a growing sense of self-consciousness as some among his people trade curious glances and hushed whispers as their best warrior only watches the battle about to take place. The word has gone out amongst the assembled Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe that no warrior should make any rash moves. Their prey is cornered, and, to the eyes of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors present, they are helpless. But as young men are often wont to do, a group of 8 teenage warriors make a foolhardy attempt at stampeding the soldiers' horses. Some of the 50 Americans fire upon them with their Spencer repeating carbines, a new technology that allows rapid reloading as opposed to the muzzle-loading rifles and muskets of only a few years prior. Though none of the young warriors are killed in their attempt, the first shots of the fight have now been fired, and now a torrent of violence is unleashed, as rapid charges are made upon the small camp, with war cries filling the air, mixing with the sounds of commands in English and the cheering of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe women and children in their respective languages. As the attacks persist, First Lieutenant Beecher coolly and calmly fires upon the charging warriors, while encouraging his men to take accurate shots and remain courageous despite their obvious numerical disadvantage. First in command, Major General Forsyth orders the men to retreat across the shallow waters of the river to a small, desolate island located midstream between the north and south banks. Forsyth and Beecher assist their 48 men in forming a barricade with the very horses they had led across the river, tying the animals off to bushes and taking cover behind them. Almost as soon as the men are able to take their positions behind their unfortunate means of cover, another series of attacks ensues, again swarming down upon them seemingly from all directions. One after another, the horses tied off to the bushes are felled by arrows and bullets from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors. As the men continue to take fire, more and more among them recognize the riotous crack of the rifles carried by the native warriors. The chilling realization falls upon the men, now ensconced upon this barren strip of earth in the middle of a sparse high-plain stream, that they are being fired upon with Henry and Spencer repeating rifles. Some of these weapons have been procured by the warriors from both prior victories, such as the utter massacre wrought upon the cavalry and the Fetterman massacre of a year and a half prior. Some of the repeating rifles, though, a technology that had been a singular means of advantage for the U.S. cavalry over the Plains tribes, have been provided by the United States government's Bureau of Indian Affairs under the pretense that they would only be used for hunting. Despite the vehement assertions to the contrary from countless correspondence penned by Army officers in the field to their superiors in Washington, D.C., besieging them to stop this clearly conflicting practice, no such effort has been made by this summer of 1868. Now, as their horses are being killed by bullets funded by their own government, the men on the island's situation is rapidly becoming more and more dire. Forsyth and Beecher agree that the only course of action left is to kill the remaining horses and order the men to dig in more substantial breastworks behind the animals' bodies. As things are, the men are far too exposed, and their small force can now only hope to hunker down and hold their position. As the iron stink of blood and viscera permeate the air, the men dig in desperate, intermittent fits, stopping only to fire on assailing bands of attacking warriors who incessantly pester them with attacks. Some of the warriors take a more surreptitious route of attack, sneaking into the thick grass that lines the riverbanks and sniping at the men now effectively trapped on the island. As the fight drags on, the mighty Roman nose continues to watch from a distance. Initially, he had thought that his participation in the fight today may indeed prove unnecessary. With the enemy trapped and assumed to be at the mercy of antiquated weaponry, he had hoped this might be a chance for some of the younger warriors to make their own marks in their initial forays into combat. But as the afternoon sun burns brighter and hotter, and more young warriors fall to the Americans' repeating rifles, Roman Nose becomes more and more burdened by his own internal dialogue heaping guilt upon himself. Then, an old Cheyenne woman, observing this revered warrior not participating in the fight, begins to mercilessly chastise him. She browbeats him with accusations of laziness and, worse, cowardice, charging that the lives of young warriors lost today will be due to his reticence to act. Finally, Roman Nose can take no more. "I will die," he says, in a low, resigned tone, "but I will go." Despite the gravity of the situation, Roman Nose fastidiously paints his face and torso, checks his weapons, says his prayers, and finally dons his legendary warbonnet. The warbonnet itself speaks to the bizarre and desperate nature of the fate of these two groups brought together here today in combat in one of the most austere environments on the continent. The following is a description of the bonnet itself, made years later by the warrior who had constructed it, White Bull, as told by George P. Grinnell. Instead of having two buffalo horns attached at the headband, one on each side, it had but one rising over the center of the forehead. It had a very long tail that touched the ground, even when Roman Nose was mounted. This tail was made of a strip of young buffalo hide and had eagle feathers all along its length. First 4 red feathers, then 4 black ones, then 4 red feathers again, and so on. 40 feathers in all. For 8 years, Roman Nose has participated in fight after fight, in full confidence that the medicine from his headpiece will protect him from harm. Now, believing its powers compromised and that it will serve merely as an ornament in his own demise, he pulls the warbonnet down upon his head and rides out with a small group of fellow warriors to make an attack on the island. Again, as they had countless times before, he and his fellow warriors steel their nerves in the last seconds before urging their war horses forward at full speed towards the small island. The attack comes on, with the Americans at the island holding their fire until the mighty warriors are only 50 yards away before unleashing a volley of fire from their repeating rifles, followed in rapid succession by another and another. In the melee, Roman Nose is grievously wounded by a bullet to his torso. After a short fight, the force retreats over the hilltops and back to the village. Here, the mighty Roman Nose is pulled from his horse, his condition rapidly declining due to organ damage and loss of blood. He is taken inside of one of the lodges where medicine is applied to his wound, but his condition continues to rapidly deteriorate. By sunrise, the legendary Cheyenne warrior, who had fought so long for so hard without incurring so much as a scratch, lies cold in death inside one of the buffalo hide lodges of the village. Wails and lamentations resound, as the loss of such a great warrior and treasured friend is one felt as palpably here on the Great Plains as it is anywhere in the long and brutal course of history. Meanwhile, back on the island, Major General Forsyth now lies prostrate, grievously wounded himself by a bullet lodged in his thigh, dangerously close to his femoral artery. He props himself up on one elbow, giving directions and doing his best to address his own wounds. Suddenly, another charge comes on. Again, the succeeding minutes are filled with the din of gunfire and war cries, until again, the warriors retreat, and all on the island falls silent. Suddenly, to Major General Forsyth and the men's eternal shock and horror, First Lieutenant Beecher wearily stands up, seemingly in some kind of battle-induced stupor. He then falls to one knee, and begins to drag himself towards Forsyth. Beecher cries out, "I have my death wound, General. I am shot in the side and dying." Forsyth desperately scrambles towards his friend. "No, Beecher, no," he manages to cry out as the young first lieutenant falls. "Yes, good night," Beecher manages to stoically mumble before his eyes close, and the soldier who had survived the horrors of so many battles utters his final words, "My poor mother." Forsyth and the men now find themselves in a state of shock and nearing despair as they lie prone, several of them injured, and now, with a total of 4 of their forces, including Beecher, Sergeant J. H. Moores, George W. Culver, and William Wilson, also lying dead on the small island in this shallow stream. Their proximity to death, in both time and space, has severely unnerved every man present, whether military or civilian. As the sun sets and a long, worrisome night unfolds, Forsyth considers his options. In the middle of the night, the men huddle behind the swelling and stinking carcasses of their horses and devise a plan. They cannot stay here, it is obvious to all. However, with all of their mounts now serving as defensive breastworks, their only means of escape will be on foot, in the middle of the high plains, with hundreds of warriors swarming the area. This is tantamount to suicide. Still, it is their only hope. Forsyth beseeches the men that someone will have to make the trek to Fort Wallace to request assistance. A 19-year-old named Simpson Jack Stillwell and a veteran French-Canadian trapper named Pierre Avalanche Trudeau, a man thought to be in his 60s but said to look much older, volunteered to make the 70-mile journey southeast, knowing that being caught will mean a certain, horrific death. The men depart before sunrise, walking backwards across the stream in hopes of deterring the native warriors who will eventually surely pursue them. They vanish into the night, and soon the sun rises on another day of hard fighting. Throughout the next 2 days, the intermittent charges from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors continue, now made even more frequently on foot, with the warriors sneaking as close to the island as possible before springing their attack. The fighting is a hard business, and as the hours drag on, it is believed that the 2 men sent to garner reinforcements have likely been caught and killed in their efforts. After 2 more nights, Major General Forsyth is now faced with 2 pressing dilemmas. One, the men he has sent out are now likely dead, and the only solution is to send another 2 men in hopes of completing a similar distance trek to a stagecoach stop due south of their present location. Here, they can wait for the next stagecoach to Fort Wallace. Scouts John J. Donovan and Allison J. Plilly volunteer for the task, and soon slip across the stream and over the horizon themselves, into the dead of night and dreadful uncertainty. The next problem to be addressed is the bullet lodged in Major General Forsyth's thigh. The projectile is pressing precariously against his femoral artery, and the wound is rapidly becoming vulnerable to infection. However, with the head surgeon having already been killed, Forsyth is unable to convince any of his men to try their hand at the rudimentary frontier surgery required to remove the bullet from his leg. This being the case, Forsyth does so himself, miraculously managing to safely remove the bullet and bandage his injured leg with only a knife as his instrument. Though he is successful in removing the bullet, the fever and ensuing infection leave many in Forsyth's command, believing that he will soon join his friend Beecher in death. Meanwhile, by some other miracle, both rescue parties sent out, that of Stillwell and Trudeau, as well as that of Donovan and Plilly, made their way to Fort Wallace, arriving only hours apart. Reinforcements are marshaled, and on the 25th of September, a full 8 days after killing their horses and digging in behind their corpses, the surviving men left trapped on the island are greeted with the sight of eventual Medal of Honor recipient Lieutenant Colonel Lewis H. Carpenter and his 10th Cavalry Regiment of the famed Buffalo Soldiers, comprised of newly freed slaves who have volunteered to serve in the dangerous world of the U.S. Army's cavalry. Carpenter and the Buffalo Soldiers themselves are greeted with the sight of 50 dead and rotting horses, as well as 5 dead and rotting bodies of their fellow Americans, as well as the unyielding stench of a week's worth of death and decomposition in combination with a huge swarm of black flies. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe, having seen the fight, at least on the whole, as merely another engagement, despite its tragic cost, have now, grown tired of making charges on the doomed island and have, in the words of author Terry Morton in his work Cheyenne Summer, made their egress much in the fashion of an audience exiting a theater after a long performance. 5 full days later, on September 30th, the rescue force, as well as the men who had been trapped on the island, forever now known as Forsyth's Scouts, make their way back into the relative safety of the confines of Fort Wallace. Major General Forsyth will go on to survive his wounds, which included another gunshot wound to his torso and a grazing wound to his head, and he will go on to a long career in the U.S. Army. Ultimately, Walter Armstrong, one of the scouts wounded during the fight, will die of his wounds in hospital. He will be buried at Fort Wallace, while his fallen cohorts in Culver, Farley, Wilson, the surgeon Dr. Moores, and First Lieutenant Beecher would all be buried on the island where they fell. Though the course of the river has changed throughout the years, rendering the original site of his grave unknowable, the island itself is today known as Beecher's Island. The final resting place of Roman Nose is, as well, lost to the march of history. After the battle, his body was placed atop a funeral pyre and left to be consumed by the animals and elements, as was the tradition of the Cheyenne. Upon learning about the fight at Beecher's Island, another famous frontier figure, General George Armstrong Custer, remarked that it was the greatest battle on the plains. The consequences of the battles of Beecher's Island would have reverberations that would be felt throughout the next bloody decade of conflict on the plains between the United States Army and tribes like the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapahoe, Kiowa, Blackfoot, and Comanche. But the stories of those battles, like the bloody tale of Custer's final fight at the Little Bighorn or the tragic massacre at Wounded Knee, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking the Join button or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.